Chapter 1. The dinner that wouldn't sit right. By the time Mark Johnson got home, the apartment already smelled like garlic and something faintly burned. Not enough to be a crisis, just enough to suggest improvisation. He hung his jacket on the back of the chair instead of the closet hook Diane preferred and listened for her. Music drifted from the kitchen, one of her work week playlists, upbeat enough to soften the edges of the day. He loosened his tie, rolled up his sleeves, and stepped into the warm light. "You're early," Diane said, smiling over her shoulder. She had her hair pulled up in a loose knot, one sock missing, a smear of something red on her wrist. "Miracles happen," Mark said. "Do I need to ask what's burning?" "Nothing's burning," she said, offended and amused at the same time. "It's caramelizing. If the smoke alarm goes off, I'm telling it you insisted." She flicked a spoon at him. Mark caught a glimpse of her screen on the counter. Emails, color-coded, half a dozen windows open. The world she brought home with her every evening had lately felt larger, louder, not threatening, just present. They sat down 10 minutes later, plates mismatched, the table cluttered with mail neither of them wanted to open. The choreography of their evenings had become familiar in the last 5 months of living together. Diane talked first, Mark listened. They ate. One of them made a joke about adulthood. It worked because it was easy. "So," Diane said, settling into her chair, crossing one leg under her. "I made progress on the Harper account today. That's the impossible one, right?" Mark asked, cutting into chicken that tasted better than it smelled. "Impossible is dramatic. Challenging," she said, then launched into details. Stakeholders, revisions, last-minute requests. Mark nodded in the right places. He liked hearing her talk about work. It made her animated, grounded her in a way that was different from how she was with him. It reminded him she existed fully outside their shared routines. "And then," she said, pausing to drink water, "I ended up talking it through with Ethan." Mark's fork hovered halfway to his mouth. "Ethan? My coworker. You've heard me mention him." Mark had. Tall, married, opinionated about everything from spreadsheets to sourdough. Mark nodded again, smaller this time. "He had some interesting insights," Diane continued, unbothered. "Not just about the project, but about communication in general." "Oh," Mark said, and took a bite he didn't want. "Like," Diane went on, warming to the topic. "He was saying that sometimes people don't realize how they come across in relationships, that they get complacent." Mark chewed slowly. "People. Partners," she said. "Boyfriends, specifically." Something in her tone, casual, confident, made his chest tighten. "And he gave an example," she said, waving her fork. "Like, if your boyfriend shuts down during conflict, it can make you feel like you're the only one doing the emotional work. And maybe he doesn't mean to, but..." Mark swallowed. He set his fork down. "Diane." She didn't stop. "But if he made more of an effort to explain what he's feeling instead of retreating, it could..." "Diane," he said again, firmer. She looked up, surprised. "What?" He took a breath, the kind he used before meetings he didn't want to be in. "Why are we talking about me like I'm a project?" The word landed between them. Diane blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Mark said, keeping his voice even, "you're telling me what another man thinks I should do to be a better boyfriend." She laughed once, quickly. "That's not..." He held up a hand. "Not angry. Precise. Let me finish." She stopped. "If I came home," Mark continued, "and sat here and told you how to be a better girlfriend based on advice from some woman at my office, you would be furious." "That's not fair," Diane said automatically. "It's exactly fair," he said. "And you know it." She opened her mouth, closed it. The music in the kitchen played on, oblivious. Mark stood up. The chair scraped louder than he intended. "I'm not yelling. I'm not breaking up with you," he said, because he could see that fear already flickering in her eyes. "But I'm not just going to let this pass." "Mark, no." He shook his head. His heart was beating faster now, but he stayed where he was, hands flat on the table. "Privacy in a relationship is foundational for me. If you're comfortable enough with someone else to talk about me behind my back like this, I don't know if I can trust you with my future." "I wasn't talking behind your back," she said, too quickly. "I'm talking to you right now." "You're repeating it to me," he said. "That's not the point." Diane pushed her chair back slightly, her brow furrowed. "So what? I can't talk to anyone about us?" "That's not what I'm saying." "It sounds like what you're saying." Mark exhaled. "There's a difference between needing support and outsourcing our relationship. There are parts of me I don't want to be public knowledge. If I have to protect my privacy from my own partner, I can't share those parts at all." Silence stretched again, denser this time. Diane's hands curled in her lap. "I didn't realize," she said finally. "I wasn't trying to undermine you." "I believe that," Mark said. "But that doesn't make it okay." Her eyes shone, anger and hurt tangling. "So what do you want me to say?" "I want you to understand why this matters," he said. "And I want you to think about whether we're actually heading toward the same future. Because if we're not, I need to know." "That's a lot to put on one dinner conversation," she said, her voice tight. "It's not about the dinner," Mark said quietly. It's about trust. He picked up his plate, appetite gone. I need some air. He left the apartment with his jacket still on the chair, the music still playing, Diane still sitting at the table. The hallway felt cooler than it should. As he walked down the stairs, Mark wondered when exactly an ordinary evening had shifted into something else, and whether it had always been heading there, unnoticed until now. Chapter 2. Space inside a shared apartment. The apartment felt different once Mark closed the door behind him. Quieter, yes, but also watchful, like it had noticed the absence of one of its inhabitants and was waiting to see what he would do with that information. He didn't actually go anywhere at first. He walked 2 blocks, hands in his pockets, then another 2, the tightness in his chest easing just enough to let him breathe normally again. The city moved around him the way it always did, cars impatient, people purposeful. But his thoughts lagged behind, still stuck at the table, at Diane's expression when he stood up. He wasn't angry anymore. That was the problem. Anger would have burned clean. What he felt instead was unsettled, like someone had shifted furniture in a room he navigated in the dark. By the time he headed back, the light in the apartment was still on. The music, mercifully, was off. Diane was on the couch, knees tucked up, her phone in her hands without her looking at it. She glanced up when he entered. Not hopeful, not defensive, just alert. I didn't know if you were coming back, she said. I didn't know either, Mark replied, toeing off his shoes. He paused, then added, I'm not leaving tonight. Her shoulders dropped a fraction. Okay. They sat there, not close enough to touch, not far enough to pretend they were strangers. The silence stretched again, this one heavier with all the things they both knew couldn't stay unsaid much longer but didn't yet have the right shape. I'm sorry, Diane said finally. I really am. Mark nodded once. I know. That doesn't mean I didn't mess up, she rushed on. When he said it, it sounded reasonable, helpful. I wasn't trying to judge you. I get that, Mark said and meant it. What I don't get is why it didn't feel strange to you. She frowned at the coffee table. Maybe it should have. Maybe, he said. He waited for the defensive tone that didn't come, and something in him softened against his will. Diane worried at her thumbnail. You asked me if we were heading toward the same future. I keep thinking about that. So am I. That scares me, she admitted, because I thought we were past those questions. Mark leaned back, staring at the ceiling. So did I. That doesn't mean they're gone. They didn't resolve anything that night. They didn't spiral into the kind of argument that left scorched earth behind, either. What they did instead was circle cautiously, each statement answered with another that didn't quite negate it, didn't quite agree. It felt like walking around a house they both owned but were suddenly seeing from opposite sides. When they went to bed, they did so with the unspoken understanding that touching would complicate things. They lay inches apart, facing opposite directions, listening to the sounds of the building settling around them. Sleep came late. Over the next few days, the apartment became a study in careful coexistence. They moved around each other politely, like guests overstaying their welcome. Conversations stuck to logistics, work schedules, groceries, whose turn it was to deal with the leaking faucet. Anything personal hovered just out of reach, acknowledged only in sideways glances and unfinished sentences. Mark noticed everything. How Diane checked her phone and then deliberately didn't say what she just read. How she laughed at something he said and then looked surprised by herself. How the absence of ease felt louder than any argument. He didn't regret speaking up. That certainty anchored him. But he did wonder, late one night as he stared at the ceiling fan tracing the same endless loop, whether drawing a line always meant widening the space between people. On Thursday evening, Diane stood in the doorway to the bedroom while Mark folded laundry with mechanical precision. I'm thinking of staying with Jess for a bit, she said. He kept folding. For how long? I don't know, she said honestly. A few days? A week? Just some space. Mark stacked a shirt, then another. That might be good. Her eyebrows knit. You're not upset? I am, he said. Just not about this. She exhaled, slow and shaky. I don't want this to turn into us drifting until we don't remember why we started. Neither do I. So this isn't a break? She asked. It's space, he said. There's a difference. She nodded, though her expression said she wasn't entirely convinced. Helping her pack was awkward in a way that veered dangerously close to comic. They stood on opposite sides of the bed, wordlessly passing items back and forth like coworkers dismantling a shared project. Diane tried to make a joke about forgetting half her chargers. Mark let out a laugh that surprised them both. At the door, she hesitated. I didn't mean to make you feel exposed, she said quietly. I know, Mark replied. But I did. She swallowed, then leaned in and hugged him, briefly, careful not to let it become something else. When the door closed behind her, the apartment went still in a way Mark had never experienced before. That night, he ate cereal for dinner and watched a show they'd started together without advancing past the opening credits. The silence no longer felt watchful, felt occupied. Over the next week, solitude gave him things he hadn't expected. Time stretched. Mornings were quieter. There was relief in not having to negotiate every emotion in real time. But there was also a longing that crept in at odd moments. when he caught himself reaching for his phone to tell Diane something mundane, when he realized he'd been saving a thought for her that no longer had a landing place. Friends, naturally, had opinions. You can't be mad about advice, his coworker Evan told him over lunch. Everyone talks. That's the problem, Mark said. Everyone talks. So what, nobody gets to vent? Venting isn't the same as dissecting, Mark replied, already weary. Diane's friend Jess, meanwhile, encouraged her to own her feelings and not shrink herself for anyone, advice that only deepened Diane's discomfort. She didn't feel like she'd been shrinking. She felt like she'd been careless. They ran into each other the following Saturday at a mutual friend's birthday gathering, neither having realized the other would be there. The room was too small, the jukebox too loud. They exchanged careful hellos, smiles practiced and brittle. You doing okay? Diane asked. Yeah, Mark said. Then, after a beat, you. She shrugged, thinking. Me too. They didn't talk much more than that. But as Mark watched her laugh with someone else across the room, he realized the space hadn't erased the problem. It had outlined it, clean and undeniable. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be accidental. Chapter 3. The break that isn't a break. By Monday, the apartment had settled into a pattern that felt provisional, like a hotel room Mark hadn't decided whether to unpack in. Diane's toothbrush was gone. The extra pillow on her side of the bed lay flat and unused, its absence louder than anything she'd taken with her. Mark moved through the rooms carefully, as if sudden gestures might break something fragile and invisible. He told himself this was temporary. Space, not separation. Words mattered, or at least he wanted them to. Mornings were the strangest. Without Diane's alarm going off 10 minutes before his, there was no staggered negotiation of the day. No half-awake conversation about who'd had the stressed dream this time. He drank his coffee standing at the counter, scrolling through emails he didn't need to read yet, because there was nothing else competing for his attention. The first night alone, he cooked pasta for one, underestimated how much food that required, and ate the leftovers straight from the pot. It was quiet, but not peaceful. Peace implied resolution. This was something else. Friends filled the gap quickly. Like nature abhorred a vacuum and Mark's social circle sensed weakness. So let me get this straight, Evan said over lunch, stabbing at a salad with disproportionate force. She quoted some guy at work and now you're reconsidering everything? I'm not reconsidering everything, Mark said. I'm reconsidering whether we agree on what's private. Evan raised an eyebrow. That seems narrow. It's not narrow, Mark replied, already tired of explaining. It's structural. Man, Evan said, shaking his head. Everyone talks about their relationship. You can't put that genie back in the bottle. I'm not trying to, Mark said. I'm saying some bottles aren't meant to be opened. Evan changed the subject, unconvinced. That night, Mark sat on the couch and queued up the show he and Diane had been watching together. He let it play for exactly 30 seconds before stopping it, unreasonably irritated by the idea of watching without her commentary. He scrolled aimlessly instead, landing on articles about communication he didn't read and messages he didn't send. Diane, on her end, discovered that space was not the relief she'd expected. Jess's apartment was loud in a comforting, chaotic way. Roommates coming and going, music always on. But it left Diane alone with her thoughts at inopportune moments. She replayed the dinner conversation on a loop, each iteration revealing a new angle she hadn't considered. She'd meant it as helpful context, not betrayal. But intention, she was learning, had a limited defense budget. Jess's advice was enthusiastic and sweeping. You didn't do anything wrong, Jess insisted, curled at one end of the couch. You're allowed to have perspective. I know I'm allowed, Diane said. I just don't know if I was thoughtful. Jess scoffed. Thoughtful? Diane, relationships aren't classified documents. They might be, Diane said quietly. To him. Jess looked at her, surprised by the tone. Do you think he's being controlling? No, Diane said immediately. I think he's being specific. Specific. The word stayed with her. Saturday came too quickly. A mutual friend's birthday, one of those whose invitations were sent months earlier, back when this problem didn't exist. Both Mark and Diane considered backing out. Neither did. They spotted each other across the room almost at once. Something passed between them, relief, caution, recognition. They exchanged tentative smiles and drifted together like gravity still applied, even at reduced strength. You look okay, Diane said, stopping herself from saying more. So do you, Mark replied. He meant it. They stood near the kitchen, surrounded by laughter that felt louder than it should have been. This is weird, Diane said. Yeah. Not bad. Just odd. Mark nodded. Transitional. She smiled at that. That's one word for it. They talked about neutral things, the cake, a mutual friend's promotion, traffic. The ease they used to have flickered in and out, unstable but undeniably still there. I've been thinking, Diane said after a pause. So have I. She laughed softly. Figures. I don't want this to turn into drifting, she said, choosing each word carefully. Where distance does the deciding for us. I don't either, Mark said. That's why this matters. They didn't solve anything in that kitchen. But when they parted later that night, there was something new between them. Not resolution, but intention. As Mark walked home alone, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, he realized the break wasn't erasing the relationship. It was outlining it, forcing him to see its shape in negative space. Whatever came next would be a choice, and that somehow made all the difference. Chapter 4. Advice, everywhere but where it belongs. Advice arrived the way spam did. Unsolicited, repetitive, and convinced of its own importance. Mark first noticed it on Tuesday, when his sister called during his commute home. He answered out of habit, already bracing himself. "So," she said, skipping the greeting entirely, "Mom told me things are weird with you and Diane." Mark sighed. "Things are complicated." "Okay, but complicated how?" she pressed. "Like breakup complicated? Or learning curve complicated?" "I don't know yet." "That's not reassuring." "It's honest," Mark said. He merged into traffic, jaw tight. "We're taking space." "Oh, space," she said brightly. "That's good. Space is healthy." "Sometimes," Mark replied. "Sometimes it's just distance with better branding." She ignored that. "Listen, relationships are about compromise. You can't expect to keep everything private forever." "I'm not," Mark said. "I'm expecting some things to be." There was a pause. "You always were sensitive about that stuff." Mark pulled into a parking spot outside the grocery store and turned off the engine. "I'm careful," he said. "There's a difference." His sister launched into a story about her own relationship. How she and her partner told each other everything, even the unflattering things, even the fights. Mark listened, polite but unconvinced. What she described sounded intimate, yes, but also exposed in a way that made him itch. He hung up 20 minutes later with a headache and the unsettling sense that everyone believed intimacy required public disclosure, as if love couldn't survive without an audience. At the store, he ran into a coworker who asked, casually, "How's Diane?" The way people did when they noticed an absence but didn't know what it meant yet. "She's good," Mark said automatically. He didn't add anything else. He liked that answer because it was true and because it ended there. Diane, meanwhile, found herself drowning in encouragement. Jess's apartment was louder than usual that night. Friends piled onto the couch. Wine glasses balanced precariously on every available surface. Someone put on music. Someone else turned it down just enough to talk over it. "So what's going on with you and Mark?" Jess asked, sliding a glass her way. Diane hesitated. "We're working through something." "Working through is code for fighting," someone said cheerfully. "No," Diane said. "It's not fighting." "Well, what did he do?" another friend asked. Diane opened her mouth, then closed it again. She felt a strange pressure behind her eyes. Not tears, exactly, but awareness. "He didn't do anything," she said finally. "I did." There was a beat of silence, followed by surprise. Jess blinked. "Okay, that's new." Diane swallowed. "I talked about him with someone else, in a way that crossed a line." "That's it?" someone scoffed. "Diane, everyone does that. If we didn't vent, we'd all explode." "I know," Diane said. She studied the condensation creeping down her glass. "But I didn't just vent. I invited analysis. So I never checked if he was okay with that," she said quietly. "I assumed." "Well, assumptions kill relationships," Jess said grandly, then paused. "But also, he can't expect to be off limits." "I don't think he does," Diane said. "I think he expects to be respected." The conversation moved on, but the words stayed with her, heavy and unresolved. Later that night, alone in the guest room Jess had set up for her, Diane stared at the ceiling and replayed the moment at dinner. How easily she'd spoken. How unremarkable it had felt until it wasn't. She hadn't noticed the shift until Mark named it, until the familiarity of talking about him had turned into something else, something public. She realized, uncomfortably, that she'd liked the validation. Not because Ethan was special, but because it felt easier to adjust Mark in theory than to confront discomfort directly with him. That realization stung. On Thursday, Mark caved and listened to a podcast Evan had recommended, something with an upbeat host and dramatic segues. The episode title promised insight, why couples need outside perspective. Mark made it 12 minutes in before shutting it off. The host spoke confidently about how healthy relationships thrived on openness, how third-party insight could prevent blind spots. Mark didn't disagree with the concept. He disagreed with the assumption that all insight was neutral, that all openness was harmless. He thought about how carefully he chose which parts of himself to reveal to whom. Not to control the narrative, but to protect something private, something still forming. Love, to him, was not a group project. That night, he texted Diane without planning to. "Mark, I'm not mad, just thinking. A lot." 3 dots appeared, vanished, then reappeared. "Diane, me too." "Mark, everyone has an opinion." Her reply came slowly. "Diane, I know. It's making things worse." They didn't say more than that. But Mark felt something shift, a recognition that the noise surrounding them was drowning out the only conversation that actually mattered. Diane felt it too. The constant chorus of advice had stopped feeling supportive and started feeling invasive. Each suggestion pulled her further from her own instincts, further from the specifics of her relationship with Mark. She realized then that the mistake hadn't just been talking about him. It had been listening to someone else's voice over her own. Separate, both Mark and Diane reached the same quiet conclusion. If there was a way back, it wouldn't come from sorting through everyone else's opinions. It would come from a conversation without an audience. Chapter 5. A conversation without an audience. They chose the cafe on Maple Street because it didn't belong to either of them. It wasn't the place where Mark had once corrected the barista on Diane's order, or where Diane always stole the good chair by the window before Mark arrived. This cafe was neutral territory. Small, bright, perpetually humming with low conversation and the hiss of steaming milk. A place where no one expected declarations, only drinks. Mark arrived first, ordered coffee he wouldn't normally choose, and sat at a two-top near the back. His hands rested flat on the table as if he needed to remind himself they were there. He felt oddly formal, like he was early for an interview he cared too much about. When Diane walked in, he recognized her immediately, not because he always did, but because his body reacted before his brain caught up. She wore a simple blue jacket, hair down, expression careful. She smiled when she saw him, tentative but real, and he stood without thinking. "Hey," she said. "Hey." They hovered for a second, then sat. The table between them felt both unnecessary and essential. "I almost ordered you something," Diane said, gesturing toward the counter. "Habit." Mark smiled despite himself. "Progress is not ordering for me. See? I'm learning." They ordered separately, the barista oblivious to the moment's importance. When their cups arrived, steam curling lazily between them, they both took a breath, as if waiting for the other to begin. Mark went first. "I want to start by saying I'm not here to win an argument," he said, "or to make you feel bad." Diane nodded immediately. "Same. I also don't think you were trying to hurt me," he added. "But I need you to understand why that dinner hit the way it did." She leaned forward slightly, hands wrapped around her cup. "I'm listening." He appreciated that she said it instead of just being quiet. "For me," Mark said slowly, "privacy isn't about control. It's about safety. There are parts of me I don't share easily. Fears, doubts, the stuff that doesn't sound flattering out of context. When I give that to someone, it matters where it goes next." Diane swallowed. "And it felt like I took that somewhere else." "Yes," Mark said. "It felt like you invited someone into a space I thought was ours." She nodded, blinking. "That makes sense. I didn't think of it like that at the time." "I know," he said. "That's what scared me. Not that you were malicious, but that we were operating off different assumptions." Diane took a breath. "Can I tell you what it felt like from my side?" "Please." "I didn't see it as inviting someone in," she said. "I saw it as asking for help navigating something that felt stuck. And I didn't realize how quickly that crossed into commentary instead of support." Mark considered that. "What was stuck?" She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "You," she said gently. "Or maybe me. I didn't know which yet." He exhaled, the tension easing just enough to matter. "Why didn't you ask me?" She looked at him, really looked. "Because I was afraid you'd shut down." He flinched. Not at the accusation, but at its accuracy. "That's fair," he admitted. "I do that sometimes." "I wasn't trying to diagnose you," she said quickly. "I was trying to understand us without making it a fight." Mark nodded. "I get that. But when that understanding comes from outside, it changes things. Suddenly I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to an echo. That wasn't my intention." "I know," he said again. "But intention doesn't erase impact." They sipped their drinks in silence for a moment, letting the words settle instead of rushing to fill the space. "So where does that leave us?" Diane asked quietly. "With choices," Mark said. "Which is scary, but also better than drifting." She smiled weakly. "I hate drifting." "Me too. I don't want my relationship to feel like a think tank exercise," she said. "I want it to feel like us. Messy sometimes, but contained." "That's all I'm asking for," Mark said. "Containment, not isolation." Diane nodded slowly. "Then I need to do better about checking where I take things. Not every frustration needs a sounding board. Sometimes it just needs courage. And I need to do better about staying present," Mark added. "So you don't feel like you have to go elsewhere just to keep things moving." Her expression softened. "You do that?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "I don't want to protect my privacy by shutting you out. I want to protect it with you." Something shifted then, subtle but real. The air between them felt lighter, less defended. "So," Diane said, tentative but hopeful, "what does trying again look like?" "Slower," Mark said. "More intentional. And fewer opinions," she said wryly. "Significantly fewer opinions." She laughed, a real laugh this time. "Deal." They didn't kiss. They didn't reach across the table. Instead, they sat there, feet brushing lightly beneath the table, grounded in the rare comfort of being understood without being concluded. When they left the cafe, they walked partway down the block together before separating with a promise instead of an assumption. Not a reunion, a restart. Chapter 6. Relearning each other. Moving back in together didn't happen with a dramatic reunion or a teary declaration. It happened on a Tuesday. Diane showed up at the apartment with 2 tote bags and a cautious smile, as if she were arriving for the first time instead of returning to something half-claimed. Mark held the door open and resisted the urge to comment on the fact that she'd forgotten her spare key. Commentary he was learning did not always need to be spoken. "Hi," she said, stepping inside. "Hi," he replied. They stood there longer than necessary, the apartment holding its breath around them. Eventually, Diane gestured vaguely. "So, I shouldn't just put things back where they were, right?" Mark considered this. Maybe not exactly where they were. She nodded slowly. "Okay, that makes sense." They unpacked with exaggerated care, like archaeologists reconstructing something precious from memory. Diane asked before placing her shoes by the door. Mark paused before sitting on his side of the couch. Nothing was wrong exactly, but everything had to be chosen instead of assumed. It was strange. It was also kind of reassuring. The first few days felt like a relationship training montage without the background music. They instituted what Diane called check-ins, which Mark privately thought sounded like something done to rental cars, but he agreed to try anyway. At first, the check-ins were clumsy. "So," Diane said one evening, perched on the edge of the bed with her notebook. Yes, an actual notebook. "How did today feel?" Mark stared at the ceiling. "Like Tuesday." She laughed, then caught herself. "Sorry, that was too vague." "No, it was fine," he said. "I just don't have a great answer." "That's okay," she said quickly. "We're practicing." "We are," he agreed. "Which is weird." "It is," she said. "But we're doing it." They overcorrected in equal measure. Diane asked permission before mentioning work frustrations, then apologized for asking permission. Mark tried narrating his feelings in real time and discovered he hated the sound of himself doing it. "I'm not shutting down," he said one night mid-sentence, mid-pause. "I'm just thinking." "I know," Diane replied gently. "I wasn't accusing." "I know," he said again. "I'm just used to defending that." She reached for his hand without looking at him. The contact was light, intentional. Progress was uneven. They slipped, caught themselves, adjusted. Arguments threatened to spark and then fizzled out under scrutiny. Humor surfaced in unexpected places. Often at the exact moment seriousness became unsustainable. Like the night Mark labeled the cabinets. "You didn't have to do that," Diane said, staring at the neatly printed mugs, snacks, miscellaneous. "I panicked," Mark admitted. Organization felt safer than conversation. She broke into laughter so sudden and loud that he joined in on reflex. Still, there were moments that tested them. On Thursday, Diane hesitated in the doorway after work, her coat still on. "What's up?" Mark asked. "I almost asked someone at work for advice today," she said, wincing. "And then I stopped myself." Mark nodded, the instinctive tightening of his chest easing when he realized she was telling him instead. "And?" he prompted. "And I came home," she said, "to ask you." He smiled softly. "I appreciate that." "So," she continued, "are you open to talking about something now, or later?" "No pressure." "Later. Not never." "Not deflected." "Now's good," he said. They sat at the table. Not the same dinner, not the same tension. Diane talked. Mark listened without bracing. When he responded, it wasn't rehearsed or guarded. It was just him. Afterward, Diane leaned back in her chair, eyes shining slightly. "That felt better." "It did," Mark agreed. That night, lying side by side, Mark realized something had shifted. He wasn't guarding his inner life from Diane anymore. He was inviting her into it on his own terms, and trusting her to keep it where it belonged. Diane noticed it too. The space she'd once filled with outside voices was quieter now. Not because she had less to say, but because she was finally saying it to the right person. They weren't fixed, but they were learning. Together. Chapter 7. The coworker in question. Diane didn't expect to see Ethan at the coffee machine that morning. She had perfected a routine since moving back home with Mark. Arrive early enough to breathe before meetings. Make 1 cup of coffee too strong, 1 too weak, and drink both while skimming emails. Ethan usually came later. That had been one of the unconscious comforts she hadn't identified until the moment he was standing there. Already stirring, already smiling. "Morning," he said easily. "You look focused." "I am," Diane replied, surprised to find that it was true. They made the quiet small talk people made when they shared a workplace but not a project. Weather, the broken elevator, the rumor of budget freezes. Ordinary, harmless things. And then, without malice or intent, Ethan tilted his head slightly and said, "So, how are things going at home?" The question landed like a test she hadn't studied for but somehow knew the answers to. Diane paused, just a beat, long enough to feel the old instinct rise, the pull toward commentary, toward framing, toward inviting analysis. It was familiar muscle memory. She let it pass. "They're good," she said instead. "We're figuring things out." Ethan nodded, interested. "That's always a process." "It is," she agreed. She lifted her mug. "Anyway, good luck with the presentation today." She walked away before the conversation could find momentum, before it could veer into the territory it once had without asking permission. Her heart beat a little faster than necessary, but underneath the adrenaline was something steadier. Choice. When she sat at her desk, she didn't feel deprived. She felt intact. Mark's day unfolded differently but echoed the same theme. At lunch, Evan leaned across the table, eyebrows waggling in a way that was supposed to signal helpful concern. "So," he said, "things better now that you're back in the same place?" Mark smiled thinly. "Better because we're talking, not because we're back." Evan nodded but didn't quite let it land. "Still think you were a little hardline about the whole advice thing." "Maybe," Mark said. He took a sip of water, considering. "Or maybe I just named something out loud that people usually ignore." Evan shrugged. "Suit yourself." Mark watched him change the subject and felt an unexpected sense of calm. He didn't need validation for the boundary anymore. The boundary existed, and that was enough. That evening, Diane told him about the encounter while they cooked together, both of them careful but relaxed in a way that felt new. "He asked how things were at home," she said, chopping onions with deliberate focus. "I almost said more." "But you didn't," Mark said. "No," she said. "I didn't feel like I needed to." Mark nodded, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Thank you for telling me." Diane looked up. "You don't feel weird hearing about it?" "Not really," he said. "Context matters. You're not asking me to compete with someone else's opinion." She smiled. "Good, because I didn't want to keep quiet about it either." They fell into easy silence, moving around each other without the self-conscious choreography of previous weeks. The moment wasn't dramatic. That, Mark realized, was the point. Later, they sat on the couch, legs tangled loosely, something half-watched on the television. "I've been thinking about something," Mark said. Diane muted the sound. "Okay. I don't want my boundaries to turn into walls," he said. "If I ever do that, if I ever shut you out instead of letting you in, tell me." She studied him for a moment. "Only if you promise to tell me when I start looking outward instead of inward." "Deal," he said without hesitation. She smiled, this time unguarded. "We're getting better at this." "Don't jinx it," Mark said. But he was smiling too. They didn't declare themselves fixed. They didn't make grand promises. They simply sat there, sharing the quiet understanding that trust wasn't rebuilt in declarations, but in small, deliberate choices, ones made when no one else was listening. And for the first time since that ill-fated dinner, that felt not just possible but sustainable. Chapter 9. A better conversation, revisited the second time it happened. It looked nothing like the first. Mark came home earlier than expected, the apartment already humming with the low, domestic soundtrack of evening. Running water, the soft clink of dishes, the smell of something lemony and warm. Diane was at the stove, sleeves rolled, hair loose, music playing quietly this time, as if neither of them needed it to fill the room anymore. "Hey," she said, glancing back. "You're early." "Miracle's still happening," Mark replied, dropping his keys into the bowl by the door. He stepped closer, kissed her cheek without thinking about it, then paused. The pause wasn't awkward. It was deliberate. "Smells good," he added. "It will," she said. "Eventually." They moved around each other with an ease that had been hard-won. No silent choreography, no checking for landmines. Just familiarity, tempered by attention. They sat down at the table with mismatched plates and the mail still stacked between them. Some things didn't need fixing to feel right. Diane took a bite, nodded approvingly at herself, then said, "Work was interesting today." Mark smiled faintly. "Interesting like good? Or interesting like you want to talk about it?" She considered. "The second one, if that's okay." "It is," he said. "I'm here." She talked about deadlines, about a meeting that had gone longer than it should have, about an idea she wasn't sure she believed in yet. She mentioned coworkers only in passing, as part of the landscape instead of the lens. Mark listened without bracing, without waiting for the moment that might catch him off guard. Then Diane paused, fork hovering. "There was a moment," she said carefully, "where I almost said something the way I would have before." Mark met her eyes. And then I didn't," she said. "I asked myself whether it belonged out there or here." He nodded, something warm settling in his chest. "What did you decide?" "Here," she said. "With you." She didn't launch into advice. She didn't relay someone else's opinion. She asked him what he thought instead. Mark leaned back slightly, considering. "I think," he said slowly, "that sometimes we talk about improving things before we've fully understood them." She smiled, relief and amusement mingling. "That sounds like you." "That's the risk of me talking," he said. "You asked." She laughed, and the sound felt easy, unguarded. They ate, talked, let the conversation wander without losing its center. When silence fell, it didn't feel like something had failed. It felt like something had landed. After dinner, they washed dishes side by side. Diane handed him a plate, their fingers brushing briefly. It wasn't charged. It didn't need to be. "Mark," she said. "Yeah. Thank you for not letting that dinner slide," she said. "I didn't see it at the time, but I needed to." He dried the plate, set it carefully on the rack. "Thank you for hearing it," he replied. Eventually, she nudged him with her shoulder. I hear things faster now. Me too, he said. I talk faster. A little. They moved to the couch, settling into their respective corners before drifting closer by instinct rather than intention. The show they'd abandoned weeks ago started up again, the characters continuing on as if nothing had happened, as if time hadn't mattered all that much. Halfway through, Diane rested her head against Mark's shoulder. This, she said quietly, feels like the future we talked about. Mark wrapped an arm around her, resting his cheek against her hair. It does. Not perfect, not dramatic, but shared. Later, as they turned off the lights and stood in the doorway of the bedroom, Mark caught a glimpse of them in the mirror. Two ordinary people, tired, comfortable, aligned not by accident but by choice. The dinner that once would have derailed everything had become something else entirely. A moment where trust didn't fracture, because it had been reinforced. They climbed into bed, the quiet settling easily around them. This time, nothing sat wrong. And that felt just right.